Dear parishioners, we will start a series of talks about moral issues. I thought it would be very convenient during this month of January, the month of life, to present this series of talks. The first talk is about basic moral principles. And for this, we start with the human act. The human act has two essential elements. The first one is knowledge, commonly called advertence, and the second is willfulness, that is, the acceptance of what is known, commonly called consent. When both concur perfectly, the act is human and free. When any of these elements is missing or imperfect, the act is not wholly human and therefore not wholly free. First, the knowledge in the human act. The essential element of the act is knowledge. The advertence that is required for an act to be moral is the practical judgment that comprises both what is done and its morality. A man in full use of his mental faculties understands what he is doing, its moral value and its moral implications. However, such advertence admits degrees, so the freedom and responsibility of the act is judged in terms of the degree of knowledge. The principal degree of advertence is full advertence and partial advertence. There is full advertence when the person is fully aware of his act and its moral value. A thief knows that he is stealing and that it is an evil action. There is partial advertence when he does not realize the full substance of the act, as it happens when one is half asleep or inebriated. Second, the will in the human act. Consent can be above all perfect or imperfect. There is perfect consent when the will fully adheres to the good being real or apparent, the good proposed by reason. It is the normal way for man to act, knowing what he is doing and wanting to do it. Consent is imperfect if the will adheres only partially to the object. Summarizing, we have knowledge, full advertence or partial advertence, and the will, perfect consent and imperfect consent. A venial sin is thinking, desiring, saying, doing, or failing to do something against the law of God in matters of less importance. A mortal sin is thinking, desiring, saying, doing, or failing to do something against the law of God in grievous matters. Mortal sin requires perfect consent because it is such a serious evil and entails such serious consequences that it can only be wanted when the subject is in full use of his faculties. Moral acts are not only those directly voluntary acts, but also those indirectly voluntary or voluntary in causa. A voluntary act is that which is wanted directly in itself. Voluntary acts can be subdivided into absolute direct voluntary act, simpliciter. It aims fully at a good in itself and by itself. It is the normal way of wanting something. Second, mixed direct voluntary act or secundum quid. It is a mixture of voluntary and involuntary act, with the predominance of the voluntary. This is the case of those who in abstract, that is, abstracting from the present circumstances, would not want this particular act, such as a merchant who does not want to throw his goods to the sea, or a man who does not want to give his money to a stranger. But in these present circumstances, although reluctantly, wants this act. The merchant, in the middle of a storm, wants to throw his good into the sea in order to save his ship and life, and a man threatened by a thief wants to give him his money to save his life. An indirect voluntary act, or in causa, indicates the influence of the will on an act which is not directly wanted in itself, but which the consequence of a directly wanted act. In such cases, the second act is said to be voluntary because the cause that originates it is voluntary. Voluntariness in causa is attributed to an action when three conditions are present: that such action is foreseen or foreseeable, that it is possible to prevent it, and that there is an obligation to prevent it. That is, the same condition for judging the voluntariness of consequences are applied here. Thus, in some cases, the homicide committed by an inebriated person, the acts of someone who has acquired and has not corrected a vice which weakens his will, can be called voluntary in causa. For example, the driver of a vehicle who ingests alcohol in excess, being conscious that his capacity of reaction before unforeseen situations will be reduced, and as a consequence involuntarily runs over a cyclist, causing his death, is guilty insofar he should and could have avoided the cause of the accident, getting drunk before driving, and did not. Then we have when there is doubt of an internal consent to a sin. The following elements must be taken into account. In a person of delicate conscience who normally avoids mortal sin, it will usually be presumed that there was no perfect consent. In lax persons who commit mortal sins habitually, it will have to be presumed that there was. Then, when there are signs of imperfect advertence, sleepiness, inculpable inebriation, partial loss of mental faculties, no consent, or at most imperfect consent, has to be presumed. Third, if there was advertence and there was no fight at all, full consent has to be presumed, even though the subject regrets the act afterwards. Fourth, if all the ways to resist were put into practice, prayer, distraction, thinking about another thing, penance, it will be presumed that there was no consent or that it was imperfect. But if no means were used, it will be presumed that there was at least imperfect or probably perfect consent. Finally, when the doubts are related to the consent given to thoughts while the subject was half asleep, the rule is: if the subject never or hardly ever accepts similar acts during daytime, and usually rejects them, it should be assumed that the subject won't accept them during sleep or at night either. The principle of double effect. This principle helps to judge the morality of those acts from which two effects a good one and an evil one follow. It can be expressed in the following way. An action from which two effects, a good one and an evil one, follow will be lawful only under certain circumstances. First, the action. The action from which both effects will follow must be good in itself, or at least indifferent, because a bad action is never lawful, even if the results are optimum. And it must be the only possible action to achieve a good result, since such action should not be carried out if there are better ways free of inconveniences. Second, the immediate effect must be the good one. It is not lawful to do evil in order to bring forth good, according to St. Paul. Non sunt facenda mala ut eveniant bona. The evil effect must be consequent, or at least concomitant, with the good one, but never prior to it, because in that case it would become the means to achieve the good effect. Third, the intention of the agent must be righteous, that is, it must seek the good effect and only allow for the bad one. In this particular case, the evil effect is allowed only because of its inseparability from the good one, but it must not be sought out or attempted in itself. And finally, the cause must be proportionate to the seriousness of the damage that the evil effect will cause, since the evil effect is always a materially evil thing, and as such it is not permissible unless there is a proportionate cause. For example, a doctor can, when there is no other efficient way, give a patient who is suffering great pain drugs that relieve the pain, but at the same time seriously affect mental lucidity or shorten his life. However, the conditions of the double effect in a pregnant woman who wants to abort in order to save her life that is endangered by gestation are not verified, although it is likely that both mother and child may die. Voluntariness over effects or consequences. For a consequence or evil effect to be imputed upon a subject, this must have foreseen it, must have the possibility of preventing it, and the obligation to do so. The act comprises the whole of the deed, with all its consequences. Theft includes all the damage caused to the victim, such as the ruin of a family and misery. Since the moral act is already perfect in the deliberate will, the consequences are only taken into account insofar they have been foreseen, or at least should have been foreseen. If someone calculates that from his free behavior many evils will follow and still does not correct himself, it must be said that he wants these evils. The various elements that permit to attribute an effect to a particular agent and therefore to impute it to him are: first, having foreseen it, because knowledge is the principle of the voluntary act. The should have been foreseen effect is assimilated to the foreseen effect, even though the subject had not foreseen it in this particular case. In order to ascertain if certain unforeseen effects should have been foreseen, it must be determined if such effects follow from the act per se or per accidens. If the effect is proper to the action per se, it should be foreseen. A fire is the proper effect of throwing a match into a haystack. This reputed follows the slander. If it does not follow per se, but in pluribus, in many, that is, in most cases, though not always, the situation is similar. Road accidents because of excessive speed, losing a job due to disrepute caused by slander. And then, if the effect follows only per accidens, and exceptionally, it falls out of the ancient's intention. A man is hurt during a hunt because he was mistaken for an animal, or a victim of slander goes mad and commits suicide. Possible of preventing evil effects. It requires not only the knowledge of the effect, but also the possibility of exerting certain power over it. For instance, the possibility of not doing what causes the effect. Otherwise, no one is obliged to do the impossible. Ad impossibilia nemo tenetur. And then the obligation to prevent evil effects. There must be an obliging link with the action. Since we are dealing with the imputability of an evil act, not with the exercise of generosity, abnegation, or charity.